Okay, today we're going to be taking some brief notes on the progressive movement and start looking at some of the reforms that they made. You should have already watched the video clip of the crash course that kind of highlighted what the progressive movement is about. So you should have a little bit of a background on the topic. But what we want you looking at is what problems were they trying to address, what actions were taken, and then we're going to be evaluating whether or not those actions actually addressed the issues. So the progressive movement formed as a reaction to the social problems caused by industrialization and urbanization. So those social issues would be things like living conditions, kind of what the people's lives were like at the time. That relates obviously to the working conditions and wages, and really just the treatment of the average person. And the goal of the progressive movement was to reform society and address the problems in the four areas listed below. So looking at labor reform, which is working conditions, looking at business reform, how did businesses conduct their business, not just on the ends of the owners in terms of how they treated their workers, but also what types of products were they putting out there and the safety for consumers. Looking at political reform, they recognized that the government wasn't functioning in an ethical manner. And then the last piece would be looking at social and moral reform. We won't focus on that really much at all. The social moral reforms were looking at providing services for people maybe who didn't have homes, also looking at improving education, and then the failed prohibition movement. So a lot of the reforms happened at the local and state level, while others were at the national level. So some issues were more centered in specific areas throughout the country, especially in some of the cities, while others needed to be addressed on the national level. Kind of relating back to when we were talking about federalism, whose job is it, whose responsibility is it to solve the problems? So what did they do to enact these changes? Well, these changes took place in a variety of ways, but some of the strategies that we'll talk about will be the investigative reporting by the muckrakers, where they really put that information out there. So looking at like the jungle with Upton Sinclair. We also had laws. They were pushing for laws, and so that's an action that people could take. And they were looking at the regulation of products and businesses. The second method would be for the people to take to the streets, protests, marches, trying to get support, lobbying, looking for national amendments. We'll talk about women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment in our next unit, but that is part of this progressive movement looking at equality for all. So some of the names that you'll hear about for the progressive movement at the local and state level, like I mentioned, would be the muckrakers. So those are the people who were going to present the issues and the ideas to the public. So like Upton Sinclair with the jungle, and then we looked at some pictures of Jacob Riis, if you remember those images from Urbanization, and he was really trying to show the people what did that look like. And at the national level, we see the progressive presidents with Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Okay, so here's today's focus. Today we're looking at labor reforms. And so the first area that they wanted to address was the fact that children were working, that there were low wages for all workers, and the amount of work, or the amount of hours they were asking the workers to complete. So what reforms took place? States actually set laws requiring a minimum age. So each of the states were looking at this, and they regulated how young you could be in order to work, and also how many hours children could work. And that's actually something we still see today, especially for you students. We see that there are regulations that are put into play in terms of how many hours you can work during the school year versus the summer. They also continue to look at limiting the working hours for women, but not for men. So if you remember, we talked about the Lowell Mills, and we talked about the fact that women's hours were decreased. That's part of the progressive movement. And then the development of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which actually set a minimum wage, a federal minimum wage. States actually can have their own as well. Overtime pay, which determines what is the standard work week, so 40 hours, and then what would be considered overtime pay, which is time and a half. And then they actually, at the national level, declared child labor to be illegal. So there is a national guideline in terms of how young you're allowed to be. Now, states can make theirs higher. So let's say the federal government says you can't work before age 12. The states could say, we actually want it to be at 14. The second piece that they were trying to address were the horrible working conditions. So remember, workers were facing very dangerous working conditions, very unsanitary working conditions. And so the states worked to create workers' compensation laws as well as fire and safety laws, which I think we know directly stemmed from that Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So workmen's compensation, we talked about this a little bit before, but it's the accident and injury protection for federal workers. So looking at setting a standard, if people were to be hurt at the workplace, what is your job responsible for, and what protections do you have to maintain a safe workplace? So what you're going to do next is you're actually going to really look at the Fair Labor Standards Act. What does it protect? What doesn't it protect? And in your opinion, does that law address the major issues that workers were facing?